Carlos Ugalde, and partner of Integralia, Carlos Ramirez, to discuss their most recent report outlining the top 10 political risks that they consider the most salient for Mexico's immediate future. At such a critical juncture for the U.S.-Mexico relationship and for North America, given recent developments, the report analyzes the top 10 key risks that could impact the business environment and democratic governance in Mexico this year. The report, which you can access in the Mexico Institute and Integralia's websites, points towards possible economic disruptions, uncertainty, and tensions, especially ahead of the 2026 USMCA review, and particularly with the recent announcement of tariffs on Mexico and Canada from President Donald Trump that have now been suspended at least for the next 30 days. The authors also discuss the impact that criminal organizations have on Mexico's business climate, in addition to several new reforms approved under President Claudia Sheinbaum's administration, especially in the energy sector and the judicial branch, which, according to the report, could debilitate the country's commercial potential. Political turmoil and concentration of power in the executive are also key risks outlined in the report. The discussion today comes at a timely and relevant moment. I am confident that Luis Carlos and Carlos' insights will be useful in understanding what is at stake for Mexico, its relationship with its top trading partner, the United States, and its role in North America more broadly. Before we begin, I want to remind the audience that we will have a Q&A session towards the end of today's conversation. You can submit your question to our panelists on the Zoom chat box or to our X account at Mexico Institute. And with that, I turn it over to our moderator for today's session, Mexico Institute Programs Associate, Maria Calderon, who will also introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Lila. Thank you for everybody for joining us this morning. So I will give the floor to one of Integralia's founder, Carlos Ramirez, and he will start presenting. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Indeed, I am going to begin. I and Carlos, we both will be talking in the next few minutes about this risk that we are presenting today here at the Wilson Center. Thank you for the Wilson Center for this opportunity. This is the 7th year in which Integralia publishes this report. And the objective, and I asked Carlos if he can put the presentation, the objective of this is to help our clients, both investors and companies, to foresee the problems ahead and try to mitigate them. The idea is to try to take advantage of the business environment that we face in Mexico. So this is a list of the 10 risks that we have in Mexico, that we foresee in Mexico for this year. These 10 risks that you see in this slide are ordered from the one with the highest probability of occurrence and the impact on the business community. And as you can see, there are many risks here that come from the outside and many that are very, very domestic. By the way, let me just tell you that a year ago, when we presented this risk for 2024, unfortunately, 9 of the 10 that we outlined a year ago were materialized. So I hope, I would hope this doesn't happen. As a consultant, we are very proud that we foresee the future. So many of these that you see here may be a reality, and some of them are already occurring in the political scene. And let me begin with the first one. Of course, the first one is Mr. Trump. And this is already in the making. This past weekend in Mexico City, both the business community and Mexican authorities were talking about how to deal with Mr. Trump. This is very problematic. We will continue to have this for a long, long time. And this risk materializes in 3 fronts. The first one is migration. And this was the first executive order by Mr. Trump when he was sworn in as president. This will be with us for a long, long time. This is a priority of the Trump administration. The second front is security. Mexican cartels have already been denominated as FTOs. In the coming days, we will know what specific cartels will be on that list. and this will increase cooperation. For many in Mexico, this is an opportunity rather than a risk. But let me just tell you that if at some moment the pressure of the US administration becomes so high that for Mrs. Sheinbaum it's difficult to maneuver within this pressure, there is a risk that radicalization or anti-Yanquismo could come out from all of this. So that is the reason why we think this may be a risk at some point. And finally, there is the question of trade. Tariffs are on hold, but tariffs will be always on the table. So the fact that yesterday Mexico managed to postpone these tariffs for a while doesn't mean that these tariffs are gone. Tariffs will be there, even if the USMCA is ratified in 2026. Mr. Trump can always bring the tariffs to the table. So this is what we see. Let me just tell you that in addition to that, and in the next slide, we can see that there are many things that we have to think about. And here you can see many challenges and questions that need to be answered. And just let me tell you 2 or 3 ideas about this. The first one is that the former paradigm of compartmentalization, that is to say, the idea that issues within the bilateral relation were treated differently for them not to contaminate others, is gone. Today, all eggs are in the same bag: trade, migration, security. And this, of course, creates a problem because we don't know exactly what is the end game. This question about the end game of all of this, nobody can tell you for sure what he wants. So this is very problematic. The second thing that I want to underline, that this is the first time that the US government makes a serious accusation about the Mexican administration of having collusion and protecting the Mexican criminal organization. This accusation made last Saturday is very serious. So despite the fact that this was not mentioned yesterday during the call by both presidents, doesn't mean that this won't be on the table in the coming weeks. And how able will Mr. Sheinbaum be to try to respond to these accusations or to offer the capture of big fishes is to be seen. And finally, let me tell you that this question of the end game will create uncertainty for the future. So the problem of this is that the Mexican markets reacted very positively yesterday. But the question is, if I am an investor in Mexico and I see that Mr. Trump can always bring tariffs to the table, then my certainty, my horizon to invest in Mexico, of course, decreases, and Mexico will have less attractiveness as a spot for nearshoring. Now I give the floor to Carlos Ramirez.
Thank you. I don't know. There we go. So we highlight a second important risk for 2025, which is related to security and criminal data, overall criminal rates in Mexico. So the administration of Claudia Sheinbaum started 4 months ago, and there are some positive signs that we would like to highlight. As most of you know, I mean, the inheritance of the past administration of López Obrador overall is not good. More than 200,000 homicides during the 6-year term of López Obrador. And the strategy of hugs, no bullets, which was basically a strategy of hands off, of not going against criminal organization, basically is gone. During the first months of the administration of Sheinbaum, we have seen a better designed strategy against organized crime, much more experienced officials leading the security agencies, and an administration that is more willing to collaborate with the US security agencies. That is still in the very early process, but we can already see some signs that Mexico is willing to collaborate again with the U.S. Security agencies after López Obrador basically killed that cooperation during his administration. So there are some positive signs there. However, our report highlights that there are also 3 or 4 issues that worries us and that makes us believe that it's going to be a difficult year in security in Mexico. First, Mexico has always underinvested in security matters, unfortunately. But now, in 2025, in a year that is critical for the organization, Mexico is seeing a cut in the security budget, and this is likely to weaken the possibilities of really the administration of having a strong effect during the year. Second, I mean, the administration is going against the bad guys. It's focusing its strategy on the most violent actors, the criminal actors in the Mexican landscape. But even though it is a strategy that it is an improvement on what we saw the last administration, there are risks to this strategy in the sense of creating more violence in the short term, and making things worse in the short term, probably better in the medium term, but in the short term, definitely this disruptive new strategy is likely to create more violence, and we are seeing already that. And then there are another criminal activities that in which the administration hasn't shown yet a clear strategy, particularly extortion, which is leading and causing a lot of disruption in several areas of the Mexican geography. We haven't seen yet what is the administration trying to achieve there. And remember, Mexico has very weak state and municipal police forces. The procurement process, judicial process is it is also a big challenge. Impunity remains very high. So it's still unclear how the administration is going to tackle that structural factors that remain in place. Overall, in a nutshell, I mean, if you see Mexico homicide rates compared to other countries, it has come down in the past years slowly, but it remains very high. And again, during 2024, the trend, the downward trend of homicides basically stagnated, and extortion rates increased significantly during the 6-year term of López Obrador. So overall, the message is it is a transition year, some positive signs, but certainly it is going to be a challenging year for the administration of Sheinbaum in terms of security.
Now there are other risks to take into account. We began with these 2, which we think are the biggest. But the third one that we want to explain is the judicial reform taking place in Mexico. Just to give you an idea about what this means, it is basically to replace, well, it is not basically, it is about replacing all judges and members of the judiciary, both at the federal and local levels, with new ones elected by popular vote. The first half of this is going to happen on June the 1st, and the second one is going to happen in 2027. Or just to give you an idea of comparison, how this happens in the US, you can see that you all only elect a few of them at the local level. The other case internationally is Bolivia, which only elects members of the Supreme Court. So the Mexican case is unique. It's absurd, I would say. And of course, what this will create is the politicization of the role of judges in Mexico. At this very moment, those members that want to participate and be nominated have become in close contact with the political class, with the political parties. So the process of politicization is already being done. We go to the next, Carlos. Here we can see that in addition to the problem of politicization, there is a problem of a declining talent and capacity and experience. You can see on the left side that in order to be a member of the Supreme Court, you only require a law degree and 3 years of experience. So imagine what that means. The Mexican judiciary over the past 30 years created a system, a civil service system, a system of meritocracy, and this is being destroyed. On the right side of the previous slide, you can see the number of candidates that will be running, more than 5,000. So imagine the position of an elector going to the polls and trying to find out which one of these hundreds of people running are the best. So this is completely impossible to carry out. What we see is these factors. Flaws in the electoral process. The Elections Institute received less than half of the budget that it requested. There is a problem of politicization, as I just mentioned. And finally, we perceive that there is going to be a very low turnout. So for many companies and investors from the US and abroad, the problem that you will face is how do you deal with new investments in Mexico? So many of you will find alternative resolution mechanisms, arbitration as the best means to deal with this. And in Mexico, just to remind you, during the past few years, during the Lopez administration, many companies, for example, in the energy sector, found out that they were able to litigate against the government in many decisions or decrees that affected them, their rights. But now that is going to be more and more difficult. Carlos.
I believe Luis Carlos,
I am here, sorry.
yes, if you can continue the presentation. Carlos had to leave the meeting.
Sorry. So the next, I am sorry about the presentation because what Carlos was handling that.
Don't
The
worry,
next-
Luis Carlos. We'll get the presentation running back on. If you could
Okay.
talk about the other risks, or if you want to delve more into the
Okay.
judicial-
No. The next risk that we want to talk about is that many investments in the energy sector are on hold. During the previous months, the Mexican administration made some constitutional amendments to declare that Pemex and CFE are going to become again public enterprises rather than productive enterprises, as was the case before. And this is creating and reducing a lot of the attractiveness of making investments in the energy sector. So this is, of course, one risk that we foresee in the future. And this means that Mexico, to take advantage of nearshoring opportunities, of course, requires energy and new investments. And if you add the uncertainty created by these domestic constitutional amendments, and in addition to that, the uncertainty created by Mr. Trump, then we have all this together that create this risk. So the pie, the potential, the investment potential in Mexico is reducing. And despite the fact that this is going to continue to flow, we foresee that this is going to be less attractive in the coming years. Carlos, are you there?
Yes, I'm sorry. Something happened with my internet. Sorry for that, but I'm back. So basically, I don't know where you left it, Luis Carlos.
I was very brief, Carlos, so just continue.
Okay, so we want to highlight this other risk for 2025 that we believe is very significant for investors because it has implications for all sectors, but particularly for two, let's say, key critical sectors for the Mexican economy, which are basically energy and telecom. So last year, as you know, there were constitutional reforms approved on energy and also indirectly in telecom because of the disappearance of the regulator in telecom. And that means that in 2025, in the next coming days, the government will have to present secondary laws for both energy and telecom. For energy, there are at least 8 new laws coming out. Probably tomorrow we will see them in finally in Congress, and in telecom they have to be published also in the next coming weeks. What we see basically is a government that in these secondary laws will propose to Congress basically a preferred treatment for state-owned enterprises, for Pemex and CFE. And basically in the telecom laws, we will see an administration that wants to have a government that wants to have more participation through basically through CFE, and it's also a state-led company in telecom called Altan. So what this implies for investors is basically a transition year that is going to be marked by an investment paralysis. We suspect that during the year, investors will learn
Luis Carlos, I believe Carlos is muted. His internet
Yes,
is off, so
sorry.
if you can continue the
Yes,
presentation.
sorry for this, guys.
Don't worry.
So this is about energy and telecommunication. As Carlos was mentioning, in the coming days, there will be secondary laws being approved in Congress. By the way, let me tell you that in this period of sessions of the Mexican Congress, which began last weekend and will continue until April the 30th, more than 70 bills will be approved, more than 70. And this includes a lot of issues, very significant. And although we anticipate that Mrs. Sheinbaum will try to attract investment and to try to maneuver to compensate all this uncertainty created by Mr. Trump, at the end, many of this new legislation will create uncertainty and within the markets. And finally, we want to talk about another risk that we think will be there for many years to come, which is an electoral reform. Although this doesn't have an direct impact on the business community, elections, and democracy, indeed, one reflection that we want to make to you is the fact that sometimes we can maneuver and we can navigate within autocracies. Mexico indeed is going into that direction. If you can, Carlos, put the next slide, please. You can see here the fact that, the next one, please. The next one, please. What we want to reflect with you is the fact that Mexico is going into a populist, authoritarian, clientelistic regime. This is not unavoidable, but it is very likely, by the way, very much in the same vein as in the US and many countries in the world. So the question for investors and companies is how much certainty can you get within this new regime that is in the making? and that may consolidate very rapidly, which is open to investment. But the question is if this can provide the certainty needed for investors. Some countries like Turkey, for example, have been able to become authoritarian on the one hand, but provide certainty and good opportunities for the private sector. For the US, the question is, can you deal with a regime of this type? Probably under the Trump agenda, this is possible. How long is this possible? That is the question to be answered. The next one, please. Just to give you an idea how powerful Morena is today. In the Senate and in the Chamber of Deputies, they have constitutional majorities. They can change the Constitution without any discussion and without any building, without any consensus building. They have 24 out of 32 governors, and they control 27 out of 32 state assemblies. Very powerful. How long will this continue? It is unknown. But the President Sheinbaum has approval rates of 80%. The social mood in Mexico is very good. Never had I seen such much optimism among the Mexican public as they have today. And so this is a new regime. Next, please. And we have a weakened system of checks and balances. On the left side, you can see all those branches already controlled by the central government. The judiciary is already being controlled. Well, it is in the making, but by the second half of this year, the judiciary will be already under the capture by the regime, and many regulatory agencies have been transferred to the central administration. The Elections Institute continues to be independent, but less and less so. And the Institute of Statistics continue to publish information which is very relevant, but many consider that it is weakening because of budgetary matters. We believe that the central bank continues to be independent. And let me tell you something that I mentioned before. President Sheinbaum has said that she's going to propose a bill to make an electoral reform in the second half of this year. We don't know what is going to include, but one risk that we foresee is that that reform may include the change of the capacities of the Elections Institute. If that happened, then you can put the Elections Institute on the left side of this slide. To conclude, I turn the floor to Carlos Ramirez.
Next, please. The last slide, we want to highlight also that this is a report of risks. Certainly, we are looking at the issues that are that could potentially have an effect on investors and companies. But we also would like to highlight that despite the risks, there are some positive signs within the new government that at least allows us to have a more constructive view about 2025. First of all, we are seeing a much more pragmatic president compared to what we saw during the past 6 years. Almost in every area, we are seeing a president that, wants to work with the private sector, that is listening to the private sector, and that has ordered her cabinet to basically work with the private companies to find common ground and to find common solutions. This sounds something relatively normal, but it wasn't during the past 6 years. So that is first something that it is important to mention. Second, Mexico's macroeconomic fundamentals, despite the erosion of some of the areas of in terms of fiscal resources that we saw particularly in the last year of the administration of López Obrador, macroeconomics fundamentals remain relatively solid. And that gives Sheinbaum some breathing room in a very difficult year, yes, with an economy that is slowing down quickly and that there is a risk of recession, but at least it provides her with some space to maneuver during the year. More private investment in energy, infrastructure, water, almost in all health, almost in all areas, the administration wants to bring back the private sector after 6 years of basically closing down the door to private sector. And as I mentioned earlier, a stronger emphasis on security and a very strong and clear commitment, no ambivalence in Sheinbaum towards her commitment to the North America integration project. Obviously, she faces a much tougher scenario with President Donald Trump, but certainly the fact that she is calling for North America to remain the backbone of the relation between US, Mexico, and Canada is something also significant to highlight. So overall, there are important risks, but there are also some positive signs in the new administration. And that's 2025. It's going to be a significantly, a very interesting year for Mexico. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis Carlos and Carlos Ramirez, for an excellent presentation. As you said, it will be indeed a very interesting year. So now we will have 30 more minutes for Q&A. I do encourage our viewers to submit your questions either in the chat or to raise your hand, and I will give you the floor. I would take advantage of this opportunity since Luis Carlos and Carlos really understand Mexico. They're experts on their fields. So if anybody has a question, now is the time.
If I may, let me kick it off, Maria, with a question that I think many in Washington are probably thinking about. And of course, we were able to derail, the imposition of tariffs, at least for the next 30 days. But what are some of the results that both of you suspect the Mexican government will have to deliver in the next month in order to prevent the tariffs from either being threatened or to be imposed yet again on the US's top trading partner?
Well, my perception is that the first action has already been taken, which is the deployment of 10,000 troops to the border. By the way, we have to be cautious about this because since 2019 and 2020, the deployment had begun because this was part of the bargaining with Trump won. And so this represents, and we are not sure about the specific numbers, this represents an addition to the people already there, but this is a win for Trump. So this makes him happy. The second one is to bring the Mexican security forces to the table. During the Lopez administration, the cooperation was reduced, and this forces Mexico to go to the table and cooperate with the US. The fact that Mexican cartels has been labeled as FTOs and the agreement reached yesterday is a good opportunity, and this will make Mexico being more cooperative. By the way, one issue that I mentioned that I want to underline is the accusation by the White House about the collusion of the Mexican government with criminal organizations, something never said before in the past 30 or 40 years. This is very serious. So we believe that if this accusation is supported by intelligence, then in this security group that is going to work in the coming years, this allegation is going to be brought to the Mexican authorities and action will be requested. How much space will Sheinbaum have to act is something to be seen, because many of these people will be close to Morena, will be close to the former president, and that's, of course, is politically very difficult to maneuver. But this is the second thing. The third one, in our opinion, is that Trump will take advantage of this agreement, which favors his position, to begin requesting things to open the review of the USMCA. Though this review happens in 2026, the negotiation has already begun. So Trump is going to demand that this review is indeed a renegotiation in terms of the content of rules of origin, for example, in terms of China and other things. So that is going to be the third aspect. And finally, maybe what is behind all of this? What is the end game? That is the question, Lila, because nobody knows what is the end game. Is this about trade? Well, it doesn't seem to be about trade. It seems to be about regional security. It seems to be about migration, fentanyl. It seems to be about his perception of winning the game. But at the end of the day, what we believe is that he's trying to change the rules of international cooperation. He's trying to change the international structure, the international distribution of power. So Mexico is part of this equation. And my perception is that at the end of the day, what he wants is to establish a force, a police force, a security and military force across the US-Mexico border with our consent. So maybe you will see in the coming years that the increase of forces across the border and Mexico being more cooperative with the US intelligence community.
Thank you, Luis Carlos. Maria, if I can just ask one more question. I know we already have a couple in the chat box, and then I'll step out. I thought it was very interesting, Luis Carlos and Carlos, that during your presentation, and I think Luis Carlos, it was you who discussed this briefly, that a lot of Mexican officials believe that a designation of a Mexican cartel as a foreign terrorist organization would actually be something that would be welcomed, right? That it actually could increase cooperation. Could you delve a little bit more into that? Because I think there's a perception, in parallel to what you have mentioned, that actually designating a cartel as an FTO could actually set the groundwork for a possible future unilateral military intervention in Mexico. So it's really interesting if you could sort of talk about the other side of the coin, right? And how people could actually see this as a positive measure for the US-Mexico relationship. Yes,
absolutely. The range of outcomes coming from this designation of cartels as FTOs the range is unknown, but of course it can imply the unilateral military action covered within the Mexican territory. The Secretary of Defense said that on the weekend, that all options are on the table. So that is possible, yes. But according to our conversations with members of the Mexican security establishment that we have had over the past few days, the perception is that this is going to create more room for cooperation, that this is going to create more, the joint forces going together after the bad guys, and that this can be an opportunity, of course. I mean, we don't know at the end of the day how this will evolve. If there were to be a unilateral covert operation or bombing by drones over Sinaloa houses producing fentanyl, for example, that will be the end of the game in terms of Mexico's cooperating with the US, because Sheinbaum would be forced to take a nationalistic stance, and that will destroy everything. So this is the worst outcome of all. So if the US understands this, and if Mexico is cooperating, Carlos showed the numbers of this very 3 months of the administration of Mrs. Sheinbaum, and you can see that the numbers are completely different. So Mexico is wanting to signal to the US that we are doing our job and cooperation is on the rise. So that is why we believe that this is more an opportunity than a risk. But if the hawks within the Trump administration decide to bomb Sinaloa houses producing fentanyl someday, then that is going to create a big problem, because Sheinbaum would radicalize, and that would create a lot of trouble.
Carlos, you're muted. I know that you want to do a follow-up. No? Okay, perfect. Thank you, Luis Carlos. So moving on with other questions. The first one is, How can the Mexican government avoid a crisis when dealing with its fiscal deficit?
Sorry, can you repeat, Maria? Sorry.
Yes, of course, Carlos. How can the Mexican government avoid a crisis when dealing with its fiscal deficit?
So the data is out for 2024, was published last week. And indeed, it has been confirmed that 2024 saw the biggest fiscal deficit of the past 35 years in Mexico. So this number is big, 5.7% of GDP. It is certainly something we hadn't seen for a long time in Mexico. And that creates problems for the Sheinbaum administration in the sense that she has to bring down that number in order for Mexico to remain with its credit worthiness numbers by Moody's, S&P's, and Fitch. And that's what Sheinbaum proposed in her budget, a important reduction of plus 2% of GDP of that fiscal deficit. There are several questions about this in 2025. Actually, we mentioned one of our risks, the risk of a fiscal reform. If the Mexican economy doesn't basically underperforms according to what the government is expecting, tax receipts do not increase on what the government is expecting, we think that during the presentation of the budget of 2026, the administration could be forced to propose a fiscal reform. We think that this has a significant risk, and that would be a way to avoid a potential reduction of Mexico credit rate in the next coming years. However, I mean, it is very challenging for the administration to bring down the fiscal deficit in a year in which the economy is slowing down quickly. And it remains to be seen if it's going to be able to cut spending again in a tough year. But overall, there is no signs of a major crisis. There is no sign, again, macroeconomic pillars remain relatively strong despite the challenges on the fiscal front. But yes, this administration cannot kick the can too much, certainly not for 6 more years. Something has to be done on the fiscal front, and Sheinbaum will have to take that political decision in order to confront this challenge.
Thank you, Carlos. A follow-up question from our audience. In terms of tax reform, how high do you see the probability of actually being implemented?
So Sheinbaum, as López Obrador, does not want a fiscal reform. And they don't want a fiscal reform because it has a very high political cost. And López Obrador was very clever in Peña Nieto did a very successful fiscal reform in terms of bringing more resources to the state, but it was a political disaster in terms of the cost that brought to Peña Nieto and his administration. So López Obrador understood that lesson well, avoided a fiscal reform during his administration, but that seems to be no longer a possibility for the Sheinbaum administration. She's trying to kick the can, but we tend to think that it is going to be impossible to do this for the next 6 years because spending pressures are growing, income receipts are relatively, let's say, stable or stagnant, and the next coming years are going to be challenging. So that is why we are calling the risk of seeing in September of this year a budget in which there will be increases on, we don't know if it's going to be a major fiscal reform, but certainly the administration will have to choose an increase on some taxes.
Perfect, Carlos. Thank you. Now, changing the topic, talking about trade and tariffs. There's a question that says, which industries in Mexico and the US would be the most effective if tariffs are implemented by the Trump administration?
So Mexico exports, I mean, our three main areas of exports, which is autos, electronics, and appliances, are obviously at risk. I mean, we export 500 billion on manufacturing goods. Very good part of that exports come from this big, broad three main areas, automobiles and auto parts. So yeah, if tariffs occur, certainly these three sectors would be impacted. Now, those are from, let's say, tariffs coming from the US to Mexico. But what happens if this goes on after February 28th? Mexico will most certainly retaliate, and the sectors in the US that would be more exposed, there are areas on agriculture, there are some consumer goods, and certainly also some manufacturing goods in some activities that supply chains will be impacted also from the US to Mexico. So everyone loses. It is very clear that everyone loses with tariffs. No one wins with that. But yeah, those are the broad sectors that would be most impacted.
Thank you, Carlos. So another question. Through Plan Mexico, President Sheinbaum seeks to set up a body to screen foreign investments and boost domestic production of goods currently imported from China. What did you see as being the biggest challenges of these initiatives? That is the first question. And then how is Mexico going to judge the effectiveness of this the performance of Plan Mexico?
Yeah. So Mexico-China trade deficit currently stands at 130 or 135 billion US dollars. So yeah, Mexico has probably a little bit less than that, but Mexico has a big deficit. Good part of those goods that come from China are imported by American companies that use inputs into their production according to the rules of the USMCA. But certainly we are using inputs in some sectors, but those inputs are being imported by US companies to Mexico. So Mexico wants to bring this down, and they want to substitute imports by developing local supply providers, local supply companies, in order to integrate better with the US supply chains. However, this sounds, let's say, good in the paper, but it's very difficult to implement. And it's not going to be something for the short term. Because, I mean, those inputs that are being brought from China, they are favored because they have lower prices, because they are something companies use in their production processes. So it's not going to be a short-term effect, and it's going to be very difficult for the Mexican government to show some improvement in the next coming years. Probably Mexico will have to use tariffs against China and in order to try to protect its local nascent domestic supply chains. But again, it is more of a medium and long-term result. And even in the medium term, I remain quite skeptical that Mexico will be able to really dent imports coming from China.
I agree, Carlos. And a follow-up question on the China front. How do you see Mexico's strategy in terms of trade and tariffs towards China?
The good news is that the Sheinbaum administration has clearly understood that China has become a political problem in terms of its local presence in Mexico and its big trade deficit with Mexico, right? López Obrador was always quite ambivalent with China in the sense that, it didn't open the entire door for China to come in, but in many ways, it played with the US, the China card, right? By being relatively, not being very aggressive against China. I think Sheinbaum understands that this cannot go on. That is good news from a North American perspective. But the problem is that China is in Mexico and they are investing and we import a lot of China. So it's not going to be easy to substitute, Maria, on that. Mexico has already implemented some tariffs against some products of China. First in the AMLO administration at the very end of the administration, and then with Sheinbaum already happening recently, some weeks ago. Probably we'll see more. We will see Mexico more aggressive against China. I think in the USMCA renegotiation, there's going to be a China clause, which Mexico will have to accept one way or another. That is going to be one of the demands of the Trump administration. It's not going to be comfortable for Mexico, but I think the Sheinbaum administration is willing to do it in order to calm down a bit these tensions that have been caused by this more trade relation with China.
Thank you, Carlos. Yes, I agree that China will be a huge component of the USMCA review in 2026. Another question, in light of current developments regarding a pause on international development funds in the US for a 90-day period, what are your impressions on how this could affect or benefit Mexico?
Well, this, of course, will hurt many countries as Mexico that receive or are helped by these funds. The USAID, for example, invests a lot of money in Mexico to try to help, for example, the reform of the judiciary before, not now, but before. It has helped local communities in fighting poverty. It has helped the academic community. So, of course, we're going to suffer from that as well as the rest of the world. Indeed, in my opinion, the US is going to suffer because this was a very effective soft power tool to create goodwill around the world. So this whole idea for me is problematic, and but in comparison to other issues of the bilateral relationship, of course, this is of a smaller scale in terms of how it will affect Mexico.
Thank you, Luis Carlos. A follow-up question on the FTO discussion for Carlos. This is a good question. Do you think the Mexican financial system is ready for the regulatory changes resulting from the designation of Mexican cartels as FTOs?
So that is a very good question. Mexico during the past decade or so has evolved its regulatory landscape in, let's say, in a positive way of being ahead of the curve in terms of creating barriers to potential criminal and basically drug money coming into the system. So banks have worked during the past decade or more, actually, probably 12 or 13 years after a big scandal struck Mexico, in the very early 2010s or something like that. So Mexico has been working on that front for a long time. And I think the banks are much more prepared now to handle this new situation than in the past. Now, having said that, Maria, I think this is going to be obviously a new ball game. This is much tougher scrutiny coming from the US. So it is very likely that banks will have to, and banks and all financial companies will have to adapt to this new situation. So because of the scrutiny is going to be even tougher. So I think it's not going to be easy, particularly for some organizations. Others are probably a little bit more advantaged than others. But overall, yeah, there will have to be more investment coming from organizations to tackle this new reality. And but yeah, I would like to highlight that during the past decade or so, Mexico has evolved its system, and it's quite a much more robust system that it had in the early years of the second millennium. So, but yeah, it's going to be difficult. It's going to create more frictions. Remittances are going to be probably much more under scrutiny. The financial companies that bring remittances and that have a lot of transactions with the U.S. exports are going to be under more scrutiny. So yeah, it's going to be challenging to deal with this. There's going to be more frictions, but Mexico is more prepared than in the past.
A follow-up question from, what is your sense of banks and financial institutions? Are they aware that about the implications of this this possible FTO, I mean, not possible, but FTO designation that will come into effect in a couple of days? Are they aware of the effects? Are they aware that they will need to change the standards because they have specific, anti-money laundering standards, but then with the FTO designation, you have a counterterrorism legal framework that will be implemented. How do you see the bank's response to this?
We've spoken with some big banks. They are aware that they will have to implement certainly a new strategy to deal with this new reality. I think it took no one by surprise, Maria. So that is important to highlight, because since Trump won, but since the political campaign in the U.S., he insisted on this one and again. And I think a lot of organizations started looking at this and what would be the implications if Trump won. At the end, he won since November. So there has been a transition of probably 2 or 3 months in which banks and financial organizations have been dealing with what this implies. So I don't think it took no one by surprise. Obviously, it is quite radical. It is something that changes the landscape. But I think there's going to have to be a lot of investment coming from financial institutions here in Mexico. Some of them, as I mentioned, are more advantaged than others. But yeah, my sense is that they are aware that this is a big thing and that there will have to be changes in the way they usually transact with the U.S. System.
I agree, Carlos. Yeah, this is a huge change, and let's see how the banks, and not only banks from Mexico, but also U.S. institutions and banks doing business with banks in Mexico will have to cover and change their standards. So that's a very interesting conversation. Then moving on to remittances, there's a question about undocumented Mexican workers in the U.S. If their remittances could face a considerable reduction because of 2 situations. Either massive deportation, and also Trump's administration has considered a possible taxation of such remittances. How do you see the situation, the impacts for the Mexican economy, for Mexico, and for migrants also?
So the second issue, taxation, during the first administration of President Trump, there was always this noise of that possibility. It never happened. So I'm still relatively skeptical that this is going to happen, but obviously it is a possibility. Deportations, yes, we are going to see a lot of that, a lot of noise. My sense is that the 65 billion remittances industry is very fragmented. It is so even if we see a major deportation process in the next coming months and years, it is not likely, my sense, it is not likely to lead to a significant reduction in remittances. I am not that worried about that because, I mean, what we saw during the pandemic, for example, everyone was expecting a fall on remittances during the pandemic because obviously a lot of jobs were lost and people were suffering a problem of jobs and possibility of sending more money to Mexico. But we saw the contrary. We saw families sending even more money because of the necessities that Mexico had at that time, the emergency that Mexico experienced that during that time. And actually remittances never came back. I mean, it continued to grow since. So probably the only big question about remittances is more on this new FTO designation and what could the administration of President Trump do in order to look more detailed on what are Mexicans sending to the US. As you know, there has been a lot of noise during the past couple of years in which some people are saying that some of this money could have, could be involved in terms of drug trafficking, but there hasn't been any significant proof of that. No one has proved that in a significant way. So, but yeah, the Trump administration is probably gonna have a better look at that. That could have an effect, but I would not envisage a collapse of remittances, even though there's challenges that certainly will face in the next coming years.
Right. Thank you, Carlos. We have a lot of questions. So the next one is, what are the potential impacts or benefits of Luis Videgaray's becoming part of the current Trump administration's financial team? And if this can be read as a betrayal towards Mexico. I've had a lot of, it's been asked more than once, this question. So people are very interested.
Well, in my case, I'm not aware that he's joining the Trump administration. I don't know about that. I'm not sure if some news appeared this morning, but as far as I understand, he's teaching at MIT and doing research on artificial intelligence. So I don't believe that would happen. And even, I mean, he has been very discreet, even joining or helping the Mexican administration. So I'm not sure about that. I didn't know about this news that you mentioned.
So probably, Maria, I don't know if the question probably implies that Videgaray could be helping, let's say, either the Mexican administration or the US administration in terms of bringing them together. I don't know if the question goes in that sense. Yeah.
The question would be if, they are saying that he is going to be part of the financial team. I am not aware of this either, but in case he would be part of the Trump's administration team, like what would be the benefit for Mexico?
I would say that is highly unlikely. Videgaray is also working on his own financial issues. I mean, he has a business related to financial issues. So I would say that this is very, very, very unlikely. Now, there has been some rumors here in Mexico that he could be willing to help to create some links between the Sheinbaum administration and the Trump administration in a way similar to the role he played during Trump 1.0, in which obviously his personal relation with Jared Kushner became a very significant issue and actually a very important one for Mexico. But he seems to be far away now from politics. He has been, as Luis Carlos mentioned, very discreet. So really we don't expect him to play a significant role in that. In any case, it would be a very discreet role, and that's it.
Thank you, Carlos and Luis Carlos. Moving on to a more technical question. Can you summarize President Sheinbaum's position on the mining industry, in particular owned by foreign investors? Since there were several significant measures taken by the López Obrador administration concerning not issuing mining licenses, and if you could also talk about the open pit mining reforms.
So we have here relatively better news than probably what was expected some months ago. So the constitutional reform that President López Obrador proposed on banning open mining basically has been, I wouldn't say canceled, but seems to us that has been postponed indefinitely. You probably saw that out of the 18 constitutional reforms of López Obrador, 13 of them basically advanced with no major problem, but 4 of them remain still waiting to be processed in Congress. And one of them has mining, water, and transgenic corn together in the same bill. President Sheinbaum last week presented a new bill related to transgenic corn and did not include neither water, neither mining. So that is a very clear sign that she doesn't want to move forward with that reform, at least in the short term. I think the reason why she has taken this decision clearly is because she understands that this is a very sensible issue for both American, but particularly Canadian companies, and that she understands that this could create a lot of disruption and noise within the USMCA framework, and obviously lead to more frictions within the 3 countries. So that has been postponed. That's the good news. Now, having said that, I mean, the reforms approved by López Obrador, basically no new permits for mining companies remain in place. And we don't expect the administration of Sheinbaum to, let's say, reopen entirely the sector. There are some positive signs that they are engaging with the private sector much more than they did during the 6-year term of López Obrador. You can speak to all mining companies in Mexico, and they are talking about this, of an administration much more open to do this. Obviously, the Ebrard in charge helps. But yeah, don't expect, let's say, to go back to the status quo before López Obrador. That's not likely to happen. But yeah, the good news is that the constitutional reform seems to us that has been postponed indefinitely.
That is indeed good news, Carlos. And then taking advantage that you talked about the GMO corn reform, could you delve more into that, taking into account that we have agriculture sector people interested?
So there are also some positive news here. The bill that President López Obrador presented, again, the one that had mining, water, and corn, was very aggressive and clearly in violation of the USMCA, because it was going to lead to problems with the US, because it included the banning of not only having transgenic corn being sembrado, here in Mexico, but also it included some restrictions in terms of potential transgenic corn coming from other countries. That bill is gone, as I mentioned, and President Sheinbaum is presenting a new bill that is, let's say, more politically oriented bill, because she wants to not leave that issue away, right? It is important politically for her administration to show that Mexico does not want transgenic corn being put in Mexico. But the restrictions compared to the López Obrador bill are much less. And seems to us that mean, there will be discussion about this if if it's still violating some issues about the USMCA agreement, but it's much less aggressive than the one that López Obrador proposed. So what Sheinbaum seems to be trying to do is going forward with a bill, being, let's say, telling to her base, to her political base, that she did not abandon this López Obrador promise of banning transgenic corn in Mexico, but at the same time being cautious in not violating the USMCA. And that bill is likely to be approved in the next coming weeks. She will celebrate, but again, she's being more cautious on the USMCA front.
Thank you, Carlos. And then a follow-up question on the constitutional reforms. Do you see any incentives for Claudia Sheinbaum to delay implementation of such reforms, specifically the judicial election or the cancellation of independent autonomous agencies?
No, we don't see any possibility that happening. She had many moments last year to do so. She had the opportunity to delay or to reduce the scope of the judicial reform, and she didn't. She had the opportunity to change the elimination of independent regulatory agencies, and she did manage to reduce the scope and to make some changes, especially in terms of the Antitrust Commission, the COFECE, and the telecommunications. She did some changes at the last minute due to the threat that this could create problems for the USMCA review. But in general, she doesn't seem to be ready to make changes to the original plan. Well, I suppose she understands how bad the outcome of the judiciary reform will be, how much uncertainty this is creating. Indeed, let me tell you that there is some contradiction. On the one hand, she has been very welcoming to private investment. She presented this plan Mexico. She's going to have an important meeting today with CEOs from big companies in Mexico. So she's trying to make the best to attract investment. But on the other hand, she has this judiciary reform. So which is the real Claudia? This is the question. We believe at Integralia that that Claudia is acting as a pragmatic president, but at the same time, she cannot change the game of the previous administration. She's very loyal to López Obrador, and therefore she doesn't want to send any signal that she's betraying the legacy. So we don't believe she's going to change the judiciary. Maybe within 2 or 3 years, when she understands the consequences, she may make some changes, but not in the short term.
Yes, indeed, Luis Carlos, it is. She protects the legacy of the previous administration. And then talking about infrastructure, what happens to Sheinbaum's ambitious infrastructure development plan, considering Trump's tariff threats and scrutiny on China? And do you think that this would open up a space for greater US-Mexico cooperation?
So Plan Mexico has a big push for infrastructure in almost all areas, right? And again, that is good news, considering that during the past administration, we didn't see basically a big infrastructure push other than 3 or 4 big projects of López Obrador. This is a much broader, a much more thoughtful plan of infrastructure. And it is also good news that the administration wants to bring the private sector to develop this very needed infrastructure in the country. However, the point right now, and probably the biggest issue, other than this noise coming from the US and the potential consequences of leading to a paralysis of investment and investors being more cautious in terms of planning long-term in Mexico. But it is also that the administration hasn't shown the private world what exactly she means by public-private partnerships, right? As you probably know, I mean, she's changing the name of public-private partnerships to a more mixed public-private relation. Whatever the name is, it's the same thing. Working together, public and private sectors to develop that infrastructure. But so far, we don't know yet neither the financial conditions she is thinking about in this new public-private partnership agreements. We still don't know what is the role that the public sector will play on those on that infrastructure development in the sense of, is the administration does the government want to participate on a 20, 30, 40, 50% role, or will it leave the private sector 100% in some areas? We still don't know. And third, and very relevant, the fact that the administration wants more control, which is part of all this concentration of power Luis Carlos mentioned before. I mean, this administration wants the state to have a big role on the economy, and that includes infrastructure. But it is not clear right now if this is going to be something that the private sector will accept. And certainly the risk premium of Mexico with this judicial reform has gone up during the past months, simply because there is judicial uncertainty, and these are long-term projects that need judicial certainty. So there are still, Maria, very open questions on how will the administration I mean, it has good intentions, but the problem is that the small word, the granularity of, we still don't know those details in order to judge if this is going to be attractive enough for the private sector.
A follow-up question on the legal certainty front. Do you see companies negotiating the agreements, the terms with, for example, international arbitration? Are they outsourcing justice to other legal mechanisms that are not linked to the Mexican judicial system?
Well, it's still early to know that, but we have heard from our clients that they are thinking about that, outsourcing, using New York courts to arbitrate future problems or to litigate there. Second, they are trying to resolve issues soon. In these next few months, they have many open litigation cases, so they want to close them. And what is going to happen at the same time is that many companies and many industries are going to try to find out how to maneuver within the new system. As I mentioned before, the current system has corruption. It have problems of lack of opportunity to resolve cases. So there is a lot of frustration in Mexico with that. But at least big companies and investors have found a way to protect themselves from arbitrary decisions by the government. So for those companies, especially those subject to US legislation that cannot buy out judges or cannot give money here and there, then they have to find out these arbitration cases outside Mexico. For Mexican companies or medium-sized companies that are not subject to those strict rules about corruption, they may find ways to deal with this new politicized system. By the way, one question that hasn't been raised is that for common Mexicans, most Mexicans are not in touch with the judiciary, with judges. They are in contact with the Ministerio Público. The Ministerio Público is the person, the agent that initiates an investigation. This is part of the Attorney General's office. This is different. For Mexicans, that is the judiciary or the police force. But for many Mexicans, maybe at the local level for cases of the common justice, as it called in Mexico, maybe the new system would deliver more, because many new judges will resolve with political criteria. So they will declare that the bad guy, that the guy that seems to be the bad guy is really the bad guy, and that will create the perception among Mexicans, common Mexicans, that the new system is working. So we don't have to we can expect that maybe in the short term Mexicans will see this system is working better than the previous one.
Thank you, Luis Carlos. I hope that is the case. Another question on the political front. Both countries are starting new administrations, Mexico and the US. Both winning candidates have strong support from the majority of voters, and they both have a political leverage within their own countries. Do you anticipate that if the relationship between both countries gets tougher, will there be a nationalist confrontation that could get things even worse? And if this is the case, would Mexico seek external sympathy with ideological allies?
Well, up until now, the Mexican populist regime have found ways to deal with your populism in the US. That happened during the first Trump administration and Mr. López Obrador. Both went along well and found ways to deal with each other. One question raised in the previous months was that Sheinbaum was not going to be as clever as to deal with with Trump, because Trump was misogynist, and because maybe there were going to be personalities very different. Well, this weekend she was smart, she did well, she was cautious, she was cool-headed. That was fine. And the question, at least from the Mexican perspective, is that within Morena, there are radical groups that at some point can raise the hand or make the voices heard about not being as submissive to Mr. Trump. Indeed, during the past weekend, we were following many of these people in the social media, and we found out that on Sunday, after Trump had decided to make the threat visible, many voices began talking about not being submissive to Mr. Trump, very nationalistic and anti-Yankee voices. But Mr. Sheinbaum, up until now, has been very pragmatic at keeping those voices down, at outlaying that our interest is with North America. But if things become more aggressive on the side of Mr. Trump in the future, and that can include, as I mentioned before, any military action by the US, unilateral military action, and that can include more aggressive measures by Mr. Trump or insults that he may make in the future, then this radical group within Morena can raise the hand and become very aggressive. And in that moment, Mrs. Sheinbaum can reduce his margin of operation. He can reduce the leeway she has to be pragmatic. And that is a risk that we'll have over the next few years. Up until now, that doesn't happen. Now, Sheinbaum, after yesterday's agreement, is very popular among groups within Morena. She has a stronger leadership, in my opinion. And how long will this be there? We don't know. I think she will be pragmatic. How much can she deliver? We think she has a lot of resources, power, discretion to continue dealing with Mr. Trump, but this is a risk that will be there for some time now.
I agree, Luis Carlos. Another question to our neighbors from the north. What about Canada? How do you see Canada's position in terms of the USMCA review? And would it be possible to alienate interest with the Canadian government and that they would be an ally with Mexico?
Well, up until last weekend, Canadians had a separate strategy with the Trump administration. Indeed, many, I mean, it did many voices within the administration, and the provinces began saying that they wanted a bilateral relationship with the US. And indeed, they were perplexed over the weekend that having contributed less than Mexico to the problems of migration and fentanyl, I mean, indeed, Canada really, I mean, it's not relevant in those problems compared to Mexico, and Canada was paying the price of this problem. So they felt betrayed by the US. And so our perception is that they feel that they have to go separated because our problems, Mexican problems, fentanyl and migration, which are much bigger than Canada. Canada is 1% of the problem. We're 99% of this problem in the whole. But they are paying the price of all these contaminations. So I would say that they will want to walk alone. And this will impact in our perception, the review and the strategy of the USMCA. As I mentioned before, we believe that this review will begin soon and that Trump will take advantage of his strong position at the moment to begin requesting that we begin the review of the USMCA, and he will make demands on the Mexican side. And we'll see how negative those demands can be for the Mexican position. And let me tell you finally that Mexico has been very ineffective in talking to the Canadian counterparts over the past few years. I mean, indeed, Mexico has been very ineffective at talking to US audiences. I mean, the Mexican business community has been saying that for these past few weeks, that the work has not been done in Washington. And that is true. And of course, that weakens the Mexican position.
Thank you, Luis Carlos. Yes, indeed. If Mexico doesn't create its own narrative here in Washington, D.C., then somebody else will do it for them. So that is problematic. So in terms of timing, we have one more question. So from a Canadian viewer, it says, it is my view that policies of the previous Mexican administration have alienated Canadian businesses. Also, the previous administration was not willing to communicate freely with Canadian politicians.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we believe that, I mean, what we saw in Mexico was basically López Obrador abandoning the relation with Canada during his tenure, because López Obrador didn't care much about anyone other than keeping the US calm and having some friends in Latin America. But other than that, he didn't spend time, resources in developing that relation. And clearly, Canada was a very evident case. Now, the issue is that with a very likely election happening in the next coming months in Canada and the potential of a new party coming into power, which has already expressed discomfort in the way the USMCA has been developed with the three countries in the same basket, it opens another window of challenge for Mexico. And although there might be possibilities of coming together, Canada and Mexico, because at the end of the day, they probably need each other in order to tame down a bit Trump's intentions, that would be the ideal world. But now we are yet not seeing that happening. Right? And with a new government coming in Canada, it's still an open question if Mexico will be able to build that common ground with Canada and work together, basically, again, to control or limit some of the big intentions of President Trump.
Thank you, Carlos. And a follow-up question to that real quick, because we have 2 more minutes to go. Is there a need for Mexico to diversify from the US market?
Yes, absolutely. We have to work on that, but being very pragmatic and clear, We can work with the European Union, with Latin America, but the nexus and the supply chains being built over the past 30 years and the closeness to the US and the cultural integration that we have with your country makes that effort. Of course, we have to do that, but it will be very difficult that we create an alternative to our businesses with the US in the coming years. So we have to continue working with America. That is the bet we did in the 30 years ago. I would believe that the idea of North America continues to be very attractive, but however, at the same time, nationalism, populism in the US and now in Canada is diluting this cultural idea of North America. We believe that at the end of the day, this is the best for the region. This is the best for Trump in trying to fight China and to trying to create a regional security. But this idea created in the 1990s is losing alliances, and this is happening. But we need to fight with that and finding new avenues to diversify our trade. But let's be clear, we export 80% of our goods and services to the US. How much can we change that? Some of that can change, but not in a significant way.
I completely agree, Luis Carlos. We could have another webinar only talking about North American integration and national security, economic security, etc. And at the end of the day, if with a weakened North America, China is the one that ends up winning. So in terms of time, thank you to all our viewers for joining. A special thanks to our great speakers, Luis Carlos and Carlos from Integralia. The report, as Lila mentioned at the beginning, can be accessed in Integralia's website and on the Mexico Institute website, both on English and Spanish. And if you have any other questions, you can reach out to Luis Carlos and Carlos from the Integralia website. So thank you very much. This recording will be uploaded to our website, and stay in touch.